right. Good morning or good afternoon, whatever the case may be, or good night, dear friends and colleagues. This is the third movement of the Vanhal Concerto. We're at the end of the series of the Vanhal Tapes now. And the third movement is, without any doubt, the most exhilarating of the three. It's very Sturm und Drang music. It reminds me very much of Carl Philipp Emanuel, Bach. It's this kind of, it's got this wild side to it, very exciting music. As long as you play it in a reasonably fast tempo. Speaking of which, speaking of tempo, I've been thinking actually the three movements of the concerto could theoretically be played with one pulse, not one tempo, but one pulse, which would be something like around 66, 69 or something. And I'll explain that to you. So you will have the first movement like and then the same pulse. And the last one. See? So you can have the same basic pulse for the three movements. It's just an idea that came to me. It's something you find in ancient music, in pre-Baroque music, this unity of pulse. And it's maybe an interesting detail to think about. Why not play the whole concerto with the same basic pulse, right? So the last movement needs a certain tempo to succeed in this Sturm und Drang feeling. The thing that inhibits us, or that kind of stops us from taking too fast a tempo, is one passage later on in the concerto, which kind of determines the tempo we're going to take. We'll get back to that. So it starts with the tutti again, and the bass player, the solo bass player, is supposed to play the tutti along with the orchestra. This gives a certain drive with the 8 notes, continuous 8 notes, which give a drive to the ensemble, and you can, when you play along with the orchestra, you can determine in great part how the music is going to sound, because you're in it from the beginning, and you can kind of steer the music in a certain direction or in a certain feeling. So you're not waiting passively until the orchestra is finished playing and then you're going to do your bit. You can really influence the playing of the whole orchestra by playing along with the other colleagues. So Sturm und Drang, certain tempo, certain excitement, and we're going to find again, like we did in the first and the second movements, enough differentiation in articulation, enough differences in pianoforte dynamics, different feelings, different atmospheres. We're going to try and get them out of the music. Some of them are written, and some of them we can add ourselves. So, for the beginning, quite easy, start with an open string. And immediately we have a choice. My favorite fingering is this one. And then the second string. Instead of course you can stay on one string as well. I'd like to have the C sharp ready from the start. So, as you can see, the most obvious fingering would be to stay on the first string even for the end. I like to play that note, that last note, on the second string as well. And the reason is that I don't want this, which is a danger, that you will have a glissando there which doesn't really belong. It's a bit the same as in the Mozart symphony. Very often you hear this and you want to avoid this glissando. See? And it's the same here. And then try to avoid the glissando, even if you stay on the first string. That being said, you can use an even more complicated fingering, but it's not that successful. I think you can do this. You could do this as well, but it won't sound so good. I think for the last note, the open G is okay. You can go back and to the second string or to the third string, but I think the first string is fine for this wild beginning. It can be a bit rough. You can have this rough sound of the open first string. That's no problem. Okay, so we have and you see the syncopated notes are long. There are no slashes, no dots, no nothing. You will see later on Vanhal uses different note lengths. Sometimes they're long, sometimes they're short with slashes. At the end they're short without slashes. So different ways of filling in these note lengths, more interesting. See, here they're short. And then a first little challenge. At the end, you have an articulation of 2 slurred and 2 separated, which brings the bowing to an up bow at the end. I'll do that again the second time. These 2 are slurred, and then you have up bow. Also interesting to see that I take these on the second string. You could stay on the first string, of course, but I like to stay here. Okay, so when we end up bow here, and we just continue, then we start the 16th notes down bow. And we just continue up and down as it comes and see where that leads us. First of all, always look at the score and see what the score says. Try to do exactly what it says, first of all. Then we'll see if we need to adjust for any reason, for a technical reason, for a musical reason. But right now, let's just continue. Okay, so far so good. And then we arrive here. I'll do it again. So this one starts up bow, which means the next bit, strangely, comes up bow again. We continue, and at last we have the, let's say, the normal bowing direction of the first beat, down bow. So if you just continue up and down as it comes, you arrive finally at a, let's say, a normal bowing direction. We shouldn't always think that upbeats should be up bow, downbeats should be down bow. You see that in a lot of these pieces in Sperger's music as well. If you just go along, finally it turns out fine. Sometimes you have to adjust a little bit for some reason, but as far as this passage is concerned, I think it's okay to just continue the bowings as they're written. Okay, so we have this. Then we have this kind of flying staccato again that we encountered before. And you see, the bowing is arranged in such a way that the second time this comes back, you end up a bow again, because there's one bar where there's 2 notes slurred and 2 notes separated. So I'll do it again from the beginning. And these are all four slurred. Like I mentioned before, the slur is not really written above the four notes, but there's no doubt about it, that the four notes are slurred. So the passage is quite clear, articulation-wise. Of course, you can separate these. These flying staccatos, you can really make them separate if you prefer. You can do them in one bow, in three separate bows. What I do position-wise, when you have the G sharp there, actually you have two position changes one after another. So mentally I put these two notes in one position. Like I mentioned before, in my mind it's one position. This helps. If you mentally put them in one position, then you only have one real position change. Easier, see? So just the way you think will help you make a good execution of the... Think of this as one position. And then we come back to that because very often in Viennese tuning we have these fixed, let's say, main positions, this one, first thumb position, and what I call the second thumb position. And we very often go just from one of these positions to the next one without the intermediate positions. So in this case, so you can do that, jump from this one to this one. There's many possibilities. You can do this. Extension on the second string, and go back there. So many possibilities. Try to find out what's the best for you. I like to go up on the second string. See? Try to find out what works for you with your instrument, with your technique. Interesting is what comes immediately afterwards. We have one of these famous octava signs again. And as I said in the beginning, I leave out most of the octavas. There's only one or two, maybe three exceptions where I leave them in. This is one example of an octava that I would take out, definitely, because it's a bit too early in the piece to get all excited. So it's kind of exciting, this passage going up. And then it's too early to go that high. I go back. So we come back to normal. We get a little bit excited and we come back to normal as if nothing happened. And we will see later on we can go to the higher octave. Then what comes next is immediately from the beginning of the concerto something really tricky. This next passage is really tricky, and we'll try to find some interesting solutions there. This is one of the examples where you can use what I would say is a typical Viennese technique, is to play across all four strings, and I do that even in the thumb position, in the second thumb position, and that would go like this. See, that's the Viennese, let's say, typical Viennese way of playing, or what I imagine would be a very Viennese way of playing it. Everything in one position, with, of course, the risk that the intonation suffers a bit, because this is a very awkward position. You need your strings really low above the fingerboard. Of course, there's no obligation to do it this way. It's just to demonstrate that it is feasible to play across the four strings in all the positions, not only in the low position, in the high position as well. There's, of course, different possibilities to play this. Another one, which I would probably use the second time it comes back, because you see the articulations are different. The first time you have articulations 2 by 2, 2 notes in each slurred, except the last one where you have, the third bar, where you have 4 notes to a bow, like this. So actually that's what's written. See? And the next one, when it comes back, is a bit more smooth. Then you always have 4 notes slurred. And then it becomes really difficult to do that beautifully here. It's a bit more difficult. And also, to make a difference, I would do it differently the second time. I would probably do this. This is smoother, this is more legato, more lyrical. So I added some dots on the fingerboard. I don't know if you can see them. I start with the first finger. Then I take over. I do that again slowly. See? So that's a smoother possibility. When you have the 2 of them, the first one will be across the 4 strings and the second one on 1 string. So you have a difference in musicality, a difference in expression. You could do the same thing twice, but I always like to have some difference between similar passages. When the passage comes back, I try to do it differently the second time. So these are 2 possibilities. There are more possibilities. You can find out for yourself. Just think about using this from time to time. It's a useful technique. See, it's 2 different characters, 2 different ways of playing, and this gives a little bit more of, let's say, 2 dimensions to the music instead of 1 dimension. You've noticed in this passage and in the other videos that gut strings present their own difficulties, and maybe you've seen that I have changed my 2 lower strings to steel strings today. That's because I have a recording coming up, and I don't want to spend most of my recording time tuning the bass, because gut strings go out of tune all the time. There's a joke that 3/4 of the time we tune the bass and 1/4 of the time we play out of tune, which could be close to the truth. So that's why I have 2 steel strings on the bottom. They're a bit more user-friendly. And also for, let's say, for ecological reasons, because I have heard and read that for a full set of bass strings, you need a hillside of sheep. That's what Nicholas Baldock told me. And a hillside of sheep, let's be more precise. There was a guy a couple of weeks ago who came to the conservatory, and he showed me a bass that he had built himself, and he had made the strings, the gut strings himself. And the low D string, which he made for the violone, was made out of the guts of 34 or 36 sheep. That's for 1 string. So I guess a whole set of strings must be something like 150 to 100 sheep, something like that. And this made me think. So maybe it's a kind of ecological reaction to what I heard about the manufacture of gut strings. Anyway, the good thing about using gut strings in Viennese tuning and using frets is not so much to be authentic. It's more that using frets, for instance, will inspire you to use different fingerings, different systems, different extensions, so it will change your musicality as well. The reactions of the gut strings to the bow will force you in a certain direction, will guide you in your musicality as well. So it's not just a technical thing, it's always a musical thing as well. So it's interesting to try these things, to try gut strings, to try frets, and see how it changes your playing. So let's go back to the 3rd movement. Then what comes next is this one. Okay, different things to say. What I like to do is this, and I retake and harmonic, and then I go back to the first string. So when I do it slowly, extension in one position, right? So and here you end your up bow, because up bow, and here the difference in the score, if you look at the score, the difference is that in the last figure you have two slurred notes and two notes separate, which brings it back to down bow. So here too you can just follow the bowing without retaking. I like this idea. Okay, it's just an idea, again, to differentiate between the first and the second times. Maybe I exaggerate with this, but I think it's interesting when you have similar things, when you have things coming back. Do it differently, do something. It's a personal pleasure, and also it gives more relief to the music. It gives more color to the music instead of playing everything the same way. So that's one of those possibilities. When you go to the second time, if the open string doesn't really speak well, of course you can always use a little trick of pulling with the left hand. Don't pull too hard. And here too you can use the left hand to pull. You will see how much you can pull so the pitch doesn't disturb too much, but it can really help. See, here too you can, instead of playing the whole series the same way, you can kind of phrase things. So you have two phrases instead of playing everything like one single block of notes. See? So always try to have some phrasing instead of just continuing without any differentiation. I try to make that clear again. Till there, and then this is an upbeat, and again. So you actually have three little, what I call micro-phrasing. It's micro-phrasing. You have three micro-phrases which again give a little bit more of depth to the music. Okay, then there's another octave sign which is written differently. It's got this kind of curly line, so you could be tempted to think that maybe this was written by someone else. On the other hand, when you look at the cadenzas in the beginning of the manuscript, you can see that Sperger himself uses both ways. He draws a straight line for the ottava, but also this curly line. So it could have been the same person, could have been at a later date or earlier. What's more important is that I don't think you should do the octave. I think it's more interesting when you have but you go down the octave again, it gives more depth to the music. Otherwise you're just doing. That's a bit ordinary, right? It's more interesting if you go to the bass register all of a sudden for this couple of notes, and then go up again. Things to think about: don't just accept what's written there. Try both. Find out what suits you, what suits the music. Also, when you have to make your final choice of octaves and how you're going to articulate everything, it's good to know the whole piece first of all, and then to decide on the structure of the piece. Where am I going to do this? Where am I going to do that? So that it's not in the moment itself, it's within the structure. You have to see these things. How can I structure the whole piece so that the whole movement kind of makes more sense? How much color will I give here and there? Should I give it away? If you give things away too soon, there's no more surprise at the end, for instance. If you go too high too soon, well, you kind of spoil it for the end of the piece, where maybe you could really go up the octave, as we will see later on. So try to, in the course of practicing, try to figure out all the different possibilities, and keep in mind that the final decision will depend on how the whole piece sounds, how you want it to, how you want to structure the thing. Okay, so I go down across 4 strings. Interesting too to mention that the trills, I talked about the trills last time, in this concerto, practically all the trills, with 1 or 2 exceptions, they have these 2 little notes before the trill. Almost always. And that's interesting. I think, I may be wrong, but when you look at earlier music, Baroque music, we start the trills with the upper note. Later on in Romantic music, we start with the lower. Not, but, and these little notes are actually something in between. Already, it's like a mixture of starting with the upper note and the lower note. It's already there. Normally you wouldn't have the B, you would immediately have the C sharp. But he gives it away already. So that's one of those little things, of those little quirky things in the concerto that you don't really pay attention to, but I think it's interesting to see that practically everywhere he uses it. And this, last time I said, the finishing of the trill is, for me, very often not in the best of taste. There are some exceptions. You can do it, for instance, at the end of the cadenza. You can do that to make sure, to make it clear for the orchestra that the cadenza is finished and that they can come in again. But in general, I would try to avoid these trill endings. But make sure you do the beginnings with the little notes like they're written in, like they're written here. You can separate them depending on the feel of the music, right? So we have the same, I'll do the same thing again. And then he goes up an octave again, which is nice, but as I said, I have chosen not to do too many octaves and to only use them in important moments of the concerto, so I wouldn't do that. I would go down again, and then to play them here, which is more tricky intonation-wise. It's a bit more difficult to know exactly where to put your fingers, right? And I use the 4th finger for the harmonic, not the 3rd finger. There's more tension in the hand if you use the 3rd finger. If you use the 4th finger, the hand is more relaxed. And you end up bow here. Up bow. And this one is up, and I go up twice. And I go up again. See? Again. Right? And then immediately go back to the tutti roll. Very exciting. And we we get the theme here. So basically the same thing as in the beginning with the long syncopated notes here. Maybe some different ways of playing. First time and second time, very slightly differently. First time you could do this. And the second time I like to do the... It's not a big difference. I like to have the G sharp here the second time. Just to have a little bit of difference. It's a bad habit of mine. I want to do things differently the second time. I try to avoid doing the same thing the same way. So first time. A little trick here. The second time. Short and then thumb. For me that's the easiest way, otherwise you have to go across strings and it doesn't really work. This kind of too many bow changes, it's too complicated. This is easier. This is much easier, okay? Try to find your own way. So second time, maybe just a little bit more gentle. And first time. See, mix and match. Maybe you could do the first time more lyrical because you have the long syncopated notes. I try to do something else every time. You could do, and the second time more to stay in the short character. But anyway, try to do something a little bit different the second time. Then we come to the noisy passage with the open string, and when you look closely at the music, you see that actually originally the articulation was different and somebody's changed it. You see that the first bar of page 15, actually the original articulation was this. It's been changed to 2 slurred plus 2 slurred, but actually originally it was, and it comes back every time the same thing. So the second time is 3 bars later on. Then the next one looks like it was written slurred originally. So you have a couple of places there on this page, right before the tutti again, 3 bars before the tutti, you have the same thing again. Actually, originally there were 4 16 notes with slashes, but they've been changed to 2 slurred and 2 slashed. I think technically it doesn't make sense to separate them. I think it was just a mistake by the copyist, so I think it's perfectly all right to do the corrected version. It doesn't make sense. So. See, here too you can differentiate between the, let's say, the ostinato in the lower register and the 2 changing notes. Or opposite, you can make the ostinato louder and the changing notes softer. Just have some kind of color change instead of again having this block of concrete. Very often it's played like these passages are played like it's like a block of concrete that they throw down on your head, and it's just a bunch of notes that don't really mean very much. So try to get some meaning, try to get some emotion there, try to get something going on. So you have 2 or 3 dimensional music instead of just something flat. The next passage then is this one. And of course you could make life easy for yourself and do this. But again, I choose not to do that for two reasons. First of all, this sounds a bit too dark. It's a bit unclear. It's not really sharp after what went before. So I like this sharpness of this brightness of the first string. Second reason is, again, you can make a difference between both figures. This one over 3 strings, a bit messy, a bit dirty, and this one very clear. And you can accentuate this difference by playing it really dirty and with a lot of strength, and the other one maybe just a little bit more elegant. Again, then you have 2 colors, 2 different things instead of 1 color. See, I always find that very interesting. See, try to do whatever fits your way of playing. This is perfectly acceptable, but it's a bit more of the same. Okay, then we come to these chords in D. See, I do everything on 1 string for this time to have this strong sound of the first string, because we're going somewhere, we're going to an end of something, and then we come back to the recapitulation. So this is an ending, it needs some strength, it needs to build up. See, and then everything on the first string. And then the last note, here I wouldn't use the open string actually. Sorry. Depends. If I play with an orchestra, maybe I'll do that, because the orchestra is going to cover the ugliness of the sound. If I play just with the viola d'amore, I'll probably choose for a cleaner and deeper sound. And then you have the resonance here. Maybe you can see that, the resonance of these 2 strings. See, this whole bass part resonates with this note. When you have this one, not so much. As you know by now, I tried to do something different from the first time. So whereas the first time we did, I'll do this. See? Also, articulation-wise, you see that here the syncopated notes are short, but they have no slashes. Does it mean anything? We're not that sure, but it's an interesting indication to try and do something different, a little change of color as compared to the first time. You can make the upbeat just a slightly bit longer, a bit more singing. See, and here too, the theme is shorter. It's a couple of bars shorter. We go immediately to the passage in 16ths. Here also the articulation is different. Where this first time we had let me see. See, we had this, and we ended up bow. Here we end down bow. Nevertheless, we just go on as it's written, down bow, and then this one up, down bow. So it's the opposite from the first time. The bow direction is opposite, but it's just perfect because we're going to this, which should be down bow anyway, right? So let's do that again. Up bow, down bow, good. Now we come to something a completely different character. This is a very lyrical passage, so it comes from this very strong theme again, which we have weakened a bit by doing this. Already anticipate a little bit of this more gentle mode, and then we come which is more singing. Now when we look at what happens before, we have these and these three notes have slashes. Musically it doesn't really make sense for me. Because I think you need this upbeat. Let's say the melody doesn't start from the D. It doesn't start there, it starts with an upbeat. And same thing here. See? So I wouldn't play the last note too short when you come from here. And I change, they're slurred, actually they're the same notes, but so the same bow, and I take the second F sharp here. And I make a diminuendo. So you can make, this is not written and it's nowhere in the music, but I think musically it makes sense to do something there, to lay the melody down. This is something new again. The lyrical passage, it was just like a dream, a daydream, which only lasted a few seconds, and we go back to business, back to something more, something stronger, something more Sturm und Drang. So this is really something separate. So this is an episode that's really separate. I'll stop here because it's getting difficult now. So we've seen this. Again, the first time I played here, second time here, just for the sake of difference. And now the passage that actually usually determines the tempo of the whole movement, because when it's too difficult and you play too fast in the beginning, you're going to be totally lost here. So you have to determine the tempo by this passage. And traditionally, this is something bass players struggle with and find it difficult. And actually, there's a very, very simple solution to that. Only one position change. We'll spend some time here because it's really very interesting, very important. I talked about these basic block positions that we have in the on the Viennese bass, and this is one perfect example of this, because if you reduce this passage to double stops, you have this. And this is a kind of passage that you have in several Viennese works. Sometimes you start here. See? So from one block position to the next. And actually this passage, if you analyze it in this way, is very easy because you only have this. So this is really very simple. Instead of you can do that. It is more spectacular, of course. It's visually, it's an element that's important as well, to really show what you're doing. So you have to make a choice. Shall I really visually accentuate this mounting figure that we're going up. It can be visually very, very beautiful to see what you hear. What you see is what you hear. Technically, I prefer this one because it's very Viennese, as far as I can guess. I don't know. I wasn't there 200 years ago. So I'll explain in detail. So you come from and you see the first string here on the first string, but in a second we will have to do this. So it's good to prepare this finger, which has to cross 3 strings at the same time, to prepare it earlier. So we come from and I use this split second to put my finger across the 3 strings already. Right, so the finger is there. Then for the this is a bit awkward because the next note is this one, but I don't want to change position there. So what I do is I use the open string, the open F sharp. I just lift the finger. I don't even lift it off the string. I just lift part of the finger. Fingertip stays on the string. And throughout this whole passage, my first finger stays on the 3 strings. See? And then again with the 3rd finger, like we said before. Right? So this makes a difficult passage quite easy. The only thing is that you have to do the work with the bow. For the left hand, it's very easy. This, I think, is very typically Viennese technique. The left hand does nothing and the right hand does everything. So, interesting to know, this block positions, and this is one of those cases where you can really use those block positions. Okay, so we've seen this. And these 2 are slurred. I think the first time they're separate. Trill on the 3rd string, I just stay in position. As I said, I'm lazy, I just play across the strings. But you have 2 options here. If you follow directions, the next one is down. You can also do 2 oboes. Kind of separate before the note with the trill, which is a little bit more exciting. And again, all the little details that make the music more interesting, more exciting, more colorful, more plastic, you can use all these things. If you only have one of these details or 2 within a movement, it doesn't make so much difference. But when you have 10 or 20 or 30 of those little things, it makes a very big difference between a performance that's so-so or a performance where people go wow, and we go for the wow, right? So it does have its importance. When you take every little detail by itself, you think, wow, come on, it's really exaggerated. But when you do all of them, then you have you reach a different level musically, I think. I might be wrong. So after that, one of the few moments in the piece where it's written dolce. That doesn't mean that the rest of the piece should never be dolce, but here it's written expressly. It's the same passage that we encountered before. You remember the difficult one? This one. Again, it's not entirely the same. Vanhal actually rarely or never writes the same thing when the same thing comes back. It doesn't do the same thing. It looks the same, but it is not the same. It's different in the 4th bar, for instance. So he starts the same, but he changes it, or he changes articulation, or he changes the notes. He always changes something, which to my mind is a proof that he was really a great composer. Who really tried to find the best solution for every moment in the piece, not just thoughtlessly copying things that he wrote before. He used to really think about, how can I do this? How can I change this? How can I have a direction within the movement? How can I change emotion? So it's really interesting to try and follow these things. And let's have a look what that does to our articulations and fingerings. So let's say we do the same thing as here. Let's see. Sorry. So far so good. But then that becomes really awkward. So I wouldn't go across 4 strings here. It's very tempting, but you get stuck. So maybe better stay on 1 string, which brings out the slurs, the groups of 2 notes a little bit better. And this makes more sense to stay on 1 string. Right? The second time, let's maybe not do the same thing. If I do the same thing, it would be this. But then I have 2 times the same color. So maybe the second time I would rather do this. Maybe. In some way, try to make a difference. Even if you use the same type of fingering, try to make a musical difference between both passages. Okay, so try to find what works. Let's do it again. Start up bow. Okay, no big problems there. When you have the series of I like to use this fingering. This is a passage that comes back in so many works. Logically, you would probably first do this, and then you have to find something is difficult. If you do this, you make the position change first, and then parallel fingering, and you're home. That's the easiest solution, I think. Again with the 3rd finger. Right, and then okay, so let's analyze this a little bit. F sharp here, which for me is an indication that I should play the trill on the 3rd string, because it's much easier. If you're gone, then you have to change. Doesn't make much sense. And then I have 2 up bows to arrive at the passage with the double stops. Now something really interesting again. This piece is full of interesting things. When you look really closely at the manuscript, you have very clearly written notes, very clear. This one's not so clear. We don't know what that is. Let's see the second time. And the second time we have... Again, it's not clear. So what's going on there? So when you look really closely, you have clear C sharp. Actually, you don't see a double stop. it looks like this note has been erased the second time as well, which is really a little bit strange. First time could be whatever, could be by accident, but the second time as well. And really, when you zoom in, it really looks like it's been erased. Logically speaking, you would have this, so why would someone have erased this A? I have no idea. Maybe because it's dominant, maybe you would have preferred this, but that's very difficult to play within the series. So for some reason it looks like somebody erased this note. I think given the tempo of the thing and the general attitude, the general drive of this, it doesn't really matter all that much. I don't think you should try to play only a C sharp there without an A and try to do all kinds of strange things in order to avoid. I think we're just I think that's okay. It's even if musically or harmonically it doesn't really fit extremely well, it doesn't matter. A bit further on there's a repeat which seems to be in the wrong place. It's possible, the way it's written, if you compare it to the first time, it's not the same. Again, it should not necessarily be the same. I had the impression that the repeat is written half a bar too early. So traditionally, and I think in most editions, it's been corrected if it's a mistake, and try to find out for yourself if this works as it's written. I don't think it's right. It looks like a mistake. Okay, so then we go on. Let's do that again. Here too, I go across the strings and I play the trill on the third strings. I arrive down bow, and here I start up bow because it's easier for the bow. It's slightly easier than going down bow, and anyway the bow arrives like this. And the second time I want to arrive up bow again, like the first time. So in this second trill, I use two bows quickly, so that I arrive up bow again. Makes it easier. Okay, and then we're nearly at the end. Now, I said I try to avoid most of the octaves, most of the extra added octaves in the piece. This is the one which I really do as it's written, and it's remarkable that for the first time there's so many octaves in the whole piece, and for the first time the writing, the handwriting octava, is different, because there's two little lines there, as if to stress that, come on guys, here you can do it, here. There's two little lines there to stress that, yes, the others you can ignore, but this one, please do it. Probably that's not the idea, but it's kind of a permission, written permission that, okay, here you can let it go, you can really do it. And I think in the general direction and the drive of the music, it's important to do it, because it's kind of an anticlimax. See, you can, of course, if you choose to do it in your lower octave, there's a couple of possibilities. Or on one string, but I prefer to stay in the higher octave. So this is one of those passages where you can abandon the idea of playing all the notes clearly, just go crazy. Sometimes I like to do this on one string, up on the third string, up on the first string. Of course, you can do more traditional fingerings. That's possible. That's going to be cleaner. Instead something totally crazy. Just for the effect, for the visual, I talked about visualizing what you're doing. It's nice if you can do it, if you just go crazy and go up on one string and up on another string twice to the octave. That's it's a choice. So you can play it cleanly as well. And then we have the articulation again, which is something you have to get used to in Viennese pieces. Is this kind of articulation, which is, it looks simple, but which is quite difficult to do well with the bow. I would personally maybe do the first bar like this, but the second bar, everything's separate. Because this gives more excitement, see? And then you have this enormous descent from the lowest note, and then for once keep the trill on the first string. And then the tutti that leads into the cadenza. So we've covered most of what I had to say about the third movement. There's probably some more information. I don't remember everything. It's going to be in my book, and it's going to be on the website anyway, in more detail than I can do in the videos. But this gives you maybe some ideas, some inspiration. It's always about the music. It's never about playing the notes, and of course it's important to play the right notes and to play them in tune and to play well and to play clean. It's very important. But it's not the most important thing. The most important thing is what you have to say. You can compare that to an actor. An actor can read his lines and he can speak them beautifully. He can pronounce every word and maybe not say much. And maybe there's another actor who doesn't really pronounce very well, but who grips you, who gives you some emotion. And it's the same with music. So of course it's important to practice and to try to get it really right and really correct. But more important is to find, what does this music tell me? What does it mean? What emotions are there? Try to find the emotions. When articulations are different, try to exaggerate the difference, otherwise it doesn't make sense. If in the end they sound more or less the same, it doesn't make sense to write them differently. So try to find these differences, try to find music that has 3 dimensions. I always like to compare that to pictorial arts. I want my music, or I like music which sounds like a sculpture, which you can walk around, rather than a painting, which is only 2 dimensions. See, I like to walk around this music. The music should be like a physical object that you can look at from different sides. Okay, so that's the end of the series of the Vanhal videos. There will probably be more videos later, but we'll start with these. We're going to record the whole concerto with the viola d'amore as well, so you can see it in context, not just bit by bit, but as a piece of music instead of just an analysis. If you have any comments, please don't hesitate. Just keep it nice. Let's be friendly, and I accept any remarks or any ideas, any criticism, if it's well founded. So don't hesitate to write and give me your ideas, give me your feedback. I'm always prepared to change my mind if I find a better idea than the ones I have. Okay? Thank you so much. See you later. Bye-bye.